There is a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. You have felt it, the kind that lives behind your eyes, the kind that is still there in the morning no matter how long you stayed in bed, the kind that makes you look at the life you built and feel nothing, not gratitude, not pride, not even sadness, just distance, like you are watching your own life through glass and cannot remember how you got to the other side of it. Something collapsed. Maybe you can name it. Maybe you cannot. Maybe it was a single moment that broke everything open. Maybe it was so gradual that by the time you noticed, the erosion had already been happening for years and you had simply been performing normalcy over the top of it. Either way, you are here now. And the version of you that existed before, the one with answers, with direction, with the quiet certainty of knowing what you were doing and why, that version feels very far away. Most people in this moment do one thing. They try to get that version back as quickly as possible, as completely as possible, before anyone notices it was ever gone. Carl Jung spent his entire career studying what happens when people do that, and what he found should change everything about how you understand what you are going through right now. The moment the collapse happens, every instinct you have says the same thing. Get back up, rebuild, move forward, get back to the person you were before this happened. And underneath that urgency is an assumption so deeply embedded, you have probably never examined it. The assumption that who you were before the collapse is who you should return to. That recovery means restoration, that the goal is to reconstruct what fell piece by piece as quickly as possible so that the people around you stop worrying and you stop feeling like a failure. Carl Jung would call that the most dangerous thing you can do. Not because rebuilding is wrong, but because returning to the same foundation that cracked is not rebuilding. It is setting the stage for an identical collapse with higher stakes later. Jung knew what it felt like to fall apart from the inside. After his break with Freud, the man he had called his mentor, his intellectual father, the center of his entire professional world, Jung entered years of profound disorientation. He described feeling suspended in midair, visions he couldn't explain, dreams that terrified him, an inner world that felt like it was coming apart at the seams. By every external measure, he was failing. By his own account, he was descending. But Jung did something that most people cannot bring themselves to do. He did not try to stop the descent. He followed it. He documented it, drew it, wrote it, sat with it for years without knowing where it was leading or whether he would come back intact. And what emerged on the other side was not a restored version of the man who had broken with Freud. It was something entirely new. A psychology, a framework for human transformation that would define the rest of his life and influence generations after him. The collapse was not the interruption of his path. The collapse was the path. Here is the thing no one tells you about falling apart. Most of the time, what breaks is not you. It is the version of you that you built for other people to see. Jung called it the persona, from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. The persona is the face you constructed to navigate the social world. The competent professional, the devoted partner, the person who has it together, the version of yourself that earned approval, respect, or simply the absence of rejection. Every person builds one. That is not pathology. That is survival. The problem comes later, when the adaptation becomes the identity, when you stop wearing the mask and start believing you are the mask. Think about what preceded your collapse. How much of your daily life was organized around maintaining an image, around being the person others needed you to be, around sustaining the version of yourself that the world had come to expect. And beneath that performance, if you are honest, what was actually there? Maybe not much. Maybe a person who had stopped asking what they actually wanted because the question felt dangerous, or selfish, or simply irrelevant to the life they had already committed to building. Jung watched this happen in patient after patient. A man who had defined himself entirely through professional success would lose the career and find that underneath it there was nothing. Not a wounded person, nothing, no preferences, no desires, no sense of what he actually valued, because the persona had been doing all the living, and the actual self had been quietly starving in the background for years. This is the specific cruelty of collapse. It doesn't feel like losing a role. It feels like dying. And in a very real psychological sense, something is dying, just not what you think. What dies is the structure you mistook for yourself. The grief is real. The disorientation is real. But what you are mourning is not yourself. You are mourning the mask and the terrible comfort of knowing exactly who you were supposed to be. Your collapse didn't begin on the day everything fell apart. It began months earlier, maybe years. There were signals, small ones first, then louder. You managed them, reframed them, told yourself this was just the cost of the life you had chosen, until the system ran out of room to compensate, and everything came down at once. Jung didn't believe in psychological accidents. He believed the psyche was purposeful, not in a mystical sense, in a structural one. Depression doesn't appear randomly. Burnout doesn't arrive without warning. Identity collapse doesn't happen to people who are living in full alignment with who they actually are. These are communications. The unconscious speaking in the only language left to it after everything else was ignored. The question worth asking, and most people never ask it, is not, why did this happen to me? That question keeps you passive, positioned as a victim of your own life. The real question is, what was I refusing to see? Because collapse almost always arrives at the exact point where the gap between the life you were living and the life that was true to you became too wide to hold. Sometimes that gap was built from external pressure, a career chosen to satisfy someone else's ambitions, a relationship maintained for fear of being alone, a persona constructed so early and so thoroughly that you genuinely forgot there was a person underneath it. Sometimes it was internal suppression, decades of swallowed anger, unacknowledged needs, desires you deemed unacceptable and buried deep enough that you stopped feeling them altogether. Jung called this the shadow. Everything you rejected about yourself, pushed into the unconscious where it continued to exert pressure whether you acknowledged it or not. Shadow material doesn't disappear when you refuse to look at it. It accumulates. It finds indirect expression in chronic tension, in inexplicable sadness, in the faint and persistent sense that something is wrong without any identifiable cause. And when the pressure becomes great enough, it doesn't ask permission. It erupts. Depression is frequently not emptiness. It is rage with nowhere to go. Burnout is frequently not exhaustion. It is a self that has been performing a life it cannot sustain. The collapse didn't betray you. It was the most honest thing your psyche had done in years. Every instinct you have right now is telling you to move forward. Get back to functioning. Rebuild momentum. Find a new direction and pursue it with enough velocity that you don't have to feel what's underneath. This instinct feels like resilience. It is not resilience. It is the same avoidance mechanism that produced the collapse, now operating under a different name. After his break with Freud, Jung could have done what most people do: redirected his energy outward, found new professional alliances, rebuilt his reputation through productivity and output. Instead, he did something that looked from the outside like falling apart. He withdrew. He played with stones on the lakeshore like a child. He sat with his visions instead of dismissing them. He descended deliberately into the interior, not knowing what he would find, not knowing if he would return intact. He called it the confrontation with the unconscious. It lasted years. What Jung understood, and what most people are never told clearly enough, is that transformation is not a surface process. You cannot think your way to a new self. You cannot optimize or schedule or discipline yourself into becoming someone fundamentally different. The psyche doesn't work that way. Change at the level that collapse demands requires going down before you go forward. It requires sitting in the ruins long enough to understand what they are made of. This is the descent. And it is not dramatic in the way people imagine. It doesn't require a wilderness retreat or a complete dismantling of your external life. It requires something harder: the willingness to stop performing recovery and start actually examining what collapsed and why. To ask the questions you have been structuring your entire life around not asking. Who was I, really, before the roles I inhabited? What did I actually feel in that relationship, that career, that identity when I was honest with myself at 3 in the morning? What did I keep pushing down because there was no acceptable place for it to go? Jung did this through his journals, through what he called active imagination, a practice of consciously engaging with the images that arose from the unconscious and treating them not as symptoms to eliminate but as messengers to understand. He wrote in what became the Red Book for years, not for publication, not for an audience, because the process of externalizing what was inside was itself the work. You don't need to replicate his method, but you need to find your version of it, the journal you actually write in honestly, not the one where you perform insight for an imaginary reader. The therapy where you stop managing the therapist's perception of you and start saying the things you have never said out loud to anyone. The silence where you stop filling every unstructured hour with stimulation, because the stimulation is a way of staying on the surface. The descent is uncomfortable in a way that is different from ordinary pain. Ordinary pain has an object, something that hurt you, a loss you can name. The discomfort of descent is more like vertigo, because what you encounter on the way down is not a wound with clean edges. It is the accumulated weight of everything you have been carrying without acknowledging it. The unlived life, the self you kept postponing, the truth you agreed not to see in exchange for stability. What came up when you fell apart? The rage, the neediness, the grief you couldn't explain, the parts of yourself that felt embarrassing or ugly or simply too much for the room. That was not the disease. That was the diagnosis. And most people, the moment they start to stabilize, do exactly the wrong thing. They push it back down. Jung spent decades mapping what he called the shadow. Not evil in a moral sense, but everything the conscious self has refused to integrate. The qualities deemed unacceptable by your family, your culture, your own internal censor. The anger you were taught made you difficult. The ambition you suppressed because it seemed arrogant. The vulnerability you buried because it felt like weakness. The needs you denied because having them made you feel like a burden. None of it disappeared. It went underground, where it continued to shape your behavior, your relationships, your choices, invisibly, which made it far more powerful than if you had simply acknowledged it. Collapse forces the shadow to the surface. Not gently. Depression reveals the vulnerability you spent years performing your way around. Burnout reveals the limits you denied in service of an identity built on invulnerability. The end of a relationship reveals the needs you never expressed because expressing them felt too dangerous. Whatever came up in your collapse, whatever you felt that you immediately judged as wrong or weak or shameful, that is precisely the material you need to examine. Not suppress again. Examine. Jung was unambiguous about this. What you refuse to make conscious will run your life from the outside. The shadow doesn't stop operating because you stop looking at it. It operates through projection. You see in others what you cannot tolerate in yourself. It operates through compulsion. The behaviors you can't explain. The patterns you can't break. The reactions that seem completely disproportionate to what triggered them. Every time you have been inexplicably furious at someone else's neediness, you were looking at your own. Every time you have despised someone's weakness, you were defending against your own. The integration Jung described is not a therapeutic exercise. It is an act of radical honesty, sitting with what the collapse exposed and saying, not as performance, not as confession, but as simple acknowledgement. Yes, this is also me. The person who is not always strong. The person who has needs that were not being met. The person who was angrier than they admitted, lonelier than they showed, more lost than the persona allowed. This acknowledgement doesn't make you less. It makes you whole in a way the persona never could. Most people who survive a collapse rebuild immediately, and most of them collapse again, not because they lack resilience, but because they rebuild on the same foundations that failed the first time. The same unexamined assumptions about what makes a life worth living. The same external anchors for internal worth. The same fundamental refusal to accept certain truths about existence that no amount of achievement can permanently outrun. Jung watched this happen with clinical grief. Patients would work through a crisis, stabilize, return to functioning, and within years be back in his office with a new collapse built on identical architecture. The content had changed, the structure hadn't. They had renovated the house without examining whether the foundation could hold weight. The foundations that fail are always variations of the same few illusions. The illusion that your value is located in what you produce, achieve, or inspire in others. So that when performance falters, the self falters with it. The illusion of invulnerability. That if you are disciplined enough, careful enough, strong enough, you can construct a life immune to loss. The illusion that living for an audience is the same as living. That the approval of others constitutes a self. That the life others find impressive is the life worth having. What does it mean to build on truth instead? It means anchoring your sense of worth in something that cannot be taken by circumstance, not in the job that can be lost, not in the relationship that can end, not in the reputation that can dissolve overnight. Jung pointed toward what he called the self, not the ego, not the persona, but the deeper organizing principle of the psyche, the totality of who you are, including everything the ego has refused to integrate. Building toward the self means building inward before building outward. It means the question that drives reconstruction is not, "What can I achieve?" It is what is actually true about who I am. And what kind of life does that truth require? This is slower, it is less legible to the outside world. A person reconstructing their life around authentic values rather than impressive ones will often look, from the outside, like they are doing less. They may be. What they are doing is building something that will hold. Jung built the tower at Bollingen with his own hands, stone by stone, without electricity, without running water, chopping wood, cooking his own food, not as deprivation, as a practice of contact with what was real and immediate and his, stripped of the professional identity, the public reputation, the intellectual authority he had built over decades. He wrote that those simple acts made him simple. That simplicity was not deprivation. It was the recovery of a self that had nearly been consumed by its own achievements. You don't need a tower, but you need the equivalent. Some space, some honest territory where the persona is not required, and the question of who you actually are can be asked without the answer needing to impress anyone. There is a word Jung used that most people misunderstand: individuation. It sounds like individualism, the pursuit of independence, self-sufficiency, the removal of all external constraint. It means almost the opposite. Individuation is the process of becoming wholly and specifically yourself, not the self the world shaped, not the self the persona performed, but the self that was always underneath the accumulation of adaptations, compromises, and strategic omissions. It is not freedom from others. It is the achievement of a genuine interior, a self solid enough to be in relation with others without disappearing into them. Jung was clear that most people never complete this process, not because they lack the capacity, but because it requires something most people are unwilling to pay: the death of the self they already know. This is the hardest truth of everything we have examined today. You are not going to recover from your collapse. Recovery implies return. Going back to a previous state, restoring what was lost. What Jung's framework describes is not recovery, it is transformation. And transformation requires that something die completely before something new can exist. The self that collapsed, the one organized around the persona, sustained by illusions, running on suppressed shadow material, that self cannot be the foundation of what comes next. It has to be released, not fixed, not upgraded, released. Most people cannot do this. They get close, they do the work, they descend, they examine the shadow. They begin to feel the outline of something more authentic, and then they flinch because the new self is unfamiliar, and unfamiliar feels like wrong. Jung wrote from his own experience that the years following his collapse were among the most isolating of his life. He had lost his professional community. His ideas were not yet formed enough to stand in public. By any conventional measure, he was failing. And yet he described those years as the most important of his life. The period from which everything that actually mattered emerged. What emerged was not a restored version of the man who had broken with Freud. It was someone new, someone who had faced the interior and was no longer running from it. Someone whose work was grounded not in borrowed authority, but in direct psychological experience. The collapse had not interrupted his life's work. It had made it possible. This is not inspiration, this is practice. First, stop measuring your progress by external reconstruction, the new job, the new relationship, the return to productivity. These things are not evidence that the inner work is done. They are neutral. What matters is whether the interior has changed. Second, continue the descent even when stability returns. The temptation, once you can function again, is to stop examining. Don't. Stabilization is not the destination. It is the platform from which the real work continues. Third, when the shadow material surfaces, the anger, the need, the grief, the parts of yourself you find difficult or embarrassing, do not manage it back into silence. Write it. Say it to someone who can hold it without flinching. Let it exist in consciousness long enough to be understood rather than suppressed. Fourth, make one decision, however small, that is true to the self the collapse revealed rather than the self the collapse destroyed. Not a dramatic gesture, a single honest choice about how you spend your time, what you say yes to, what you finally refuse. That choice is the first stone of the new foundation. Jung built his tower one stone at a time. You do the same. The work does not end here. Individuation is not a destination. It is the direction of a life. What you carry forward from this collapse, how you use what it revealed, whether you build on truth or reconstruct the illusion, that is the question your psyche has been trying to ask you for longer than you know. You have heard it now. The self that collapsed was real. The grief is real. The disorientation is real. The feeling that you have lost something essential is real. But here is what Jung understood and what most people are never told. The collapse did not take your self from you. It revealed that the self you thought you were was never the whole story. What remains in the rubble is not nothing. It is everything that was true about you that the persona was covering. The self you postponed, the needs you denied, the desires you buried because there was no acceptable place for them, the anger that had nowhere to go, the vulnerability you performed your way around for years. All of it still there, still waiting, not as damage, as material, as the raw substance of a self that could not be built before because the persona was always in the way. Jung wrote, "My life is a story of the self-realization of the unconscious, not a story of success, not a story of recovery, a story of the unconscious forcing its way into consciousness, whether you invite it or not. You did not choose this collapse. But you are here now, in the middle of it, which means you have been given something most people are never forced to confront: the chance to stop building on what was false, and to find out for the first time what is actually there. That is not the end. That is the beginning of the only work that ever mattered. If something in this video names something you have been carrying alone, leave it in the comments. You do not need to explain it, just leave it there. Someone else reading it will recognize it, and that recognition is its own kind of medicine. The work that begins here does not end with a single conversation. There is more to face, and somewhere beneath everything that fell, you already know it.